Welcome again, everyone, and Fiona and I are here this week with Stuart Donald. Great to have you back on the podcast, Stuart, because we really appreciated and enjoyed when you were on before. So it was the one that was called The Union Dividend Debunked. It's been one of our really, really popular podcasts, and it's still getting views, although it's a few months back. So I was looking at that, and coincidentally, just at the end of that podcast, we just talked a bit about first past the post and proportional representation. And one of the things you said was how first past the post disproportionately favours the right, and it also tends to disenfranchise poorer communities. And, we got into a bit of a discussion about would PR be a place to go for the future. Of course, we've got a proportional voting system for Holyrood. Bit of a complicated one, but it's proportional, and we've got proportional representation for local authorities in Scotland. Down in England, they don't even have them for local authorities, and they certainly don't have proportional setup for Westminster. So, when you got in touch and said that you'd written a paper about the advantages and disadvantages of those two systems, first past the post, proportional, and done it for Compass, we thought, oh, great, let's definitely have a chat to you about that. And it was quite handy, wasn't it, Fiona? Because
last week's guest is Lena from Compass, and she actually mentioned you during her talk, and we didn't jump in and say, oh, we know him, but we could have done.
You carry on and give us a bit of an intro to the background, to what made you write it and everything. And should we drop in at the moment that Polly Toynbee referred to it on The Guardian and, said that if anyone hadn't read it, they really should be reading it. So, bear that in mind, folks.
Oh, great introduction. So thanks very much. I mean, the genesis is this work that, again, that, as you said, we spoke about last time. So I spend a lot of most of my free time looking at how to make the case for proportional representation and demonstrate that first past the post is a busted flush, and countries that use it are driving themselves into the ground, and that's the case more or less everywhere, certainly in the Western world. Through work, as you said, that I've been doing with Compass, I've been talking to them. Obviously, one of their core things is they are a major campaigner for PR on a cross-party basis, and we got together and we discussed doing a piece of work looking at how proportional representation coped with the rise of the populist right on the mainland. And I had done an initial piece of work on the Netherlands, which showed a really remarkable story there. Again, that in the UK we never get close to. All we know in the UK, as you will know, about the Netherlands is their leader Geert Wilders has big hair, looks and styles himself on the sort of like the Orban Trump model, is apparently racist and has a lot of very extreme views. But actually, the PR system in the Netherlands has really done a job on their populism, in that he gets into power. In fact, his party becomes the biggest party, but because of PR, he's forced to negotiate, and all the nasties, all the dark edges, all the anti-Islamic, anti-EU, extremisms are removed. So effectively what you get is his party in power, but much more constrained. And so I discussed that with Compass. They were very interested in that. Again, when you get under the surface and you look at just what happened there, other things that happen in PR, like how quickly the Netherlands has developed new parties that have become really successful very quickly, how the PR system in the Netherlands is able to focus on specific issues, housing, their challenges around nitrogen pollution, and how parties actually come to exist in the short term, but very quickly become successful as part of these coalition arrangements to focus on these areas in the way that never happens, in the UK. So we were really interested in that. But what we said was, wait a minute, well, we need more, right? We're not going to win an argument on the basis of one country. So we then looked at Sweden, Finland, Austria, and to some extent Italy. And in all of those cases, particularly the Northern European cases, the same story emerged, right? Peculiarities to do with local phenomena and so on, but all the same basic story. The populist right gets to power, something like 20-25% of the vote. They form part of coalition government, but those other parties, the mainstream parties, force then the extremisms of their agenda out. And so, they get to participate in government, but their extremism is removed.
Is that what you mean when you talked about this sort of systemic friction that that exists. Yeah,
exactly. So systemic friction is this term that we used in the paper to describe effectively what happens in any coalition arrangement, right? So there must have been this between the SNP and the Greens when they established their coalition, 5 years ago. It's effectively the process of, I think of it like a gauntlet, right? You come in with your manifesto, but it's not going to survive in its, original form. The process of negotiation, because everybody has to compromise, But that's so much more important when you're dealing with an extremist party. So as long as there's a balance of mainstream parties, and that's the case, in Europe, in Western Europe, and you expect that it probably will be, then the populists always have this problem. Now, the contrast there is with the UK, and this is where it becomes really interesting, right? Because you can tell my story there to most people in the UK, including me, before I started doing this work, and you go, right, okay, I've sort of got that, but it doesn't really mean anything. I don't have a perspective for that. What's the context here? The context is that in the UK, we're looking on across the North Sea, and all we're hearing is populist right parties in power, right? It's disastrous, is it not? It sounds terrifying. In the UK, we've managed to stop that. We haven't got Farage in power. We're near power. He's only got 5 seats. Surely first past the post is therefore better at managing away and keeping that sort of extremism away. But then when you look at what the data tells you, right, and what the manifestos tell you about who's more extreme out of the mix, then the UK, certainly under the Tories, was manifestly the most extreme government, okay, compared to these 5 countries with their populist right parties in power on almost every agenda point typical of the populist right. So immigration, no one has anything like Rwanda, right? No one has come close to putting that in place. The Danes flirted with it, looked at it, and didn't get anywhere near it. All these populist right parties come to power with ambitions on mass repatriations, extremely draconian rules about how to process and deal with immigration. None of them get anywhere near it. They're red lines for the other parties before they get to power. Likewise, on things like carbon neutral and a whole range of other things. So effectively, one of the things the paper tries to do is it's got a table that just shows you and compares which country has ended up with the most extreme populist right policies, and in every case, the UK.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me when I was reading the paper was how much higher the actual voter participation is in those PR countries. And I can see why, if they think, even if somebody has views which are represented by the populist right, those are their views, and if it's to do with housing shortages or farmers being unhappy with the nitrogen content rules and things, they must still feel that they are represented because they're able to vote people in that have those views. And that way they're engaged in the politics in a way that ours aren't. Because even in all income brackets, ours, we've got less people take part in the voting system, possibly because they just don't think their vote matters.
That's absolutely right.
But they're not leaving these issues to fester, are they, by keeping them out of Parliament altogether? They're bringing them in and yet dealing with them and knocking the sharp edges off, but perhaps still giving them something that addresses the root cause of the problem. Our system doesn't allow that. It's all or nothing, isn't it?
That's right.
Well, and kind of linked into that was what I picked up on was when you were saying, well, okay, you can argue that the system here works because they don't get represented, they don't get into the Commons, but actually people are still voting for them. And then that kind of leads to this sort of build-up of pressure where, understandably, one might not understand why they want to vote for them, but they do. So, and you can certainly understand that there's going to be frustration and resentment and probably in the end cynicism, if not anger, about a vote not ever kind of having a result. And that's a build-up of pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's right. That is one of the things, again, that I don't know why it doesn't surface. It's not more obvious to us. But this point about co-optation that happens with, the votes for UKIP and then Brexit and then the Reform Party. And I think it's still in the minds of people. Maybe now it's changing because they can see how much power Reform has and the onset of the likelihood of them forming the next government. But until recently, I think that the sort of like the sense in the street and certainly the way he was treated by the establishment was still relatively harmless because he never manages to muster any votes. And then you look at what's happened, though, right? And you can take it from Cameron, and this is part of the wider story. I've got another paper coming on the subsequent sort of truth about how damaging the first past the post system has been for the UK over the last 50 years. But in the middle of all that, this co-optation thing starts happening because of the two-party system, right? Where you end up moving to the right, as the Labour Party thought they had to do in the 1990s. That kicked off then a sort of a chain reaction. So when the Tories came back to power, they had to deal with the Labour Party who'd moved more to the centre, which gave them obviously a need to differentiate themselves by moving to the right themselves. But just around about that time was when all the sort of like the phenomenon about almost the forgotten term of Euroscepticism emerged. So this was a threat to them from their own right flank, which dragged them even further to the right. So all these things that they did, like Cameron leaving the mainstream conservative European People's Party, right? That again went unsung. Yes. This is something that Danny Dorland talks about very compellingly. It was should have been a signal to the British establishment. Wait a minute, why are we moving? Why is our so-called centre-right party getting into bed with these modern but aggressive-looking Eastern European right-of-centre parties that are much more about sovereignty and identity and so on? Why would we, Western European sort of like country, part of the post-war settlement, find ourselves with our centre-right party moving there? And then all the rest, Farage, being successful in the European elections, again, dismissed as a joke even before Brexit, who was interested in that? But that was, all these things were the reasons that the Tories had to move to the right. And this thing, co-optation, obviously can happen anywhere. But when you've only got two parties, then you're much more vulnerable to it. So effectively, if you look back with hindsight, Nigel Farage has been the most successful populist, if you want, commentator, agitator in Europe, arguably, right? In that he's forced the British right to do all these incredible things, not least Brexit, the most violent, upsetting piece of destruction that's happened certainly in Western Europe since the Second World War, and then all the subsequent things that then unleashed as a result of that, because we are no longer constrained by EU rules and so on. So Rwanda being probably the ugliest and the most spectacular example. So this is where, if you've got that context to say, look at what PR does in terms of how it compromises and constrains, as you said, the structural fiction argument. There's none of that here. There's none of it. Even today on the radio, Stammer gets as much abuse from his own left, because he appears to try and mimic a lot of what Farage does by doing the same, by co-opting a lot of these things. So all these things are really bringing to the fore that in today's world, first past the post is useless. It just is not a democratic tool. As Danny said, we're barely democratic.
Yeah. So is that what you describe as, I think you call it majoritarian drift, which I have to confess I haven't quite got my head around yet. So it's that sort of thing. It's like party that was centre gets pushed to the right a bit. So one that was left further right has to go further. But does it never happen the other way around? Well,
and that's a really interesting question, and I get that quite a lot. But in modern times, in the last 40 to 50 years, it hasn't. There hasn't been a successful movement to the left. But in theory, it could, because it's all part of the two-party system problem. That unless there's a consensus between the two parties about staying in the centre ground that we used to have in the UK, right, up until the late 70s, this sort of phenomenon of Gatsskillism, or Bateskillism it was called, where both the Tories and the Labour Party vied with each other to spend money on the general public. But that meant that they were anchored to the middle. That all got unpicked when the neoliberal revolution happened. And whilst neoliberalism has affected PR countries as well, I mean, everybody's absorbed greater ideas about marketising and so on, not nearly to the same extent, because you've always got these coalitions, and you've had successful social democratic parties, successful in the sense that they have consistently reinvented themselves, got back into power, and that means they bring a progressive voice into the coalitions, which means that you normalise phenomena of around welfare and the vestiges of progressivism that we all recognise, investing properly in things like the health service and other benefits. Like, again, we think we do that in the UK, but you look at the gap there is now, especially over the last 50 years. Absolutely enormous.
This was quite a shocker, I think, the gap between the health spending and the dark blue one there is a European average, and the Tories were never reaching the average of Europe. But then Labour's the same. When they get in, they still are nowhere near it. And they're sort of, you said a minute ago, vying to spend the most. Well, these two are vying to spend the least, aren't they?
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, you don't get that from the rhetoric, even as it's replayed today, that we still have ringing in our ears, Tony Blair's great announcement, or he's talked about it since his era, that his Labour Party oversaw the greatest increase in public spending since the Second World War, which is true, but then your benchmark is the Tories. I mean, it's hardly a challenging benchmark compared to his peers in the continent, most of whom, by the way, were led by slightly centre-right governments, as it happened when he was in power. He was spending less. In Tony Blair's reign, Ireland jumped over the UK to leave the UK with the worst child mortality figures, right? Happened during Blair's reign. This is Ireland, right? You're talking the early 2000s, so they're emerging from the doldrums from the 1980s, and they're leaving us behind. So again, there's all this data that shows just exactly the point that you made there, that whilst they tried to spend, and let's be fair, right? They were trying to do the right thing. They are typically trying to do progressive things, right? But they can't, because to stay in power, they have to think about upsetting voters that are going to look at this as profligate and being weak, and so on. And that's it. It's even worse now than it was,
And I've just pulled up the child mortality stats as well. This was something linking back to our conversation with Danny Dorling. One of the things it said was, why is it always child statistics we go for? And he said, well, because they're available, but also you have to be a really heartless son of a bitch to want your children to be in poverty. And yet, look at that. Our mortality rate is worse than the European average. Now, I think if you asked any man in the street whether UK's mortality rate was worse than Europe, I don't think they would think it is. I thought the same, actually. And we did a podcast with Philippa Whitford just a couple of weeks back, and she raised, as part of a different argument, she was talking about the importance of presenting well-being policies, but she used the mortality rate for under 15s in the UK, and I mean, it's a staggering number of kids that are being lost every year. Just not anything that's really in the forefront of what we hear about in political debate. I mean, not even by the people you'd think would be talking about it.
Yeah. That's right. And if I can just segue into the other thing that I don't cover in the slides, but certainly in the paper, is a dedicated section on this phenomenon of welfare chauvinism, right? And so welfare chauvinism is a term that's been coined to describe what populist right parties are doing with welfare politics in order to maintain and grow their voter base, right? So it is effectively maintaining current welfare settlements, right, which in these countries, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland and Austria, is amongst the best in the world, certainly much higher in the UK. But the nasty bit is that they offer that only for incumbent populations, which means they would be denied to incoming immigrants. Okay, now Farage has been making noises about this as well recently, but the big difference is that not since the 70s has there been anything like this level of spending, right? In these countries, in the UK, right? We've spent materially much less than that. So these countries, these policies are like, if you want, more socialist, more left-leaning than anything that Labour Tory have done since the 70s. But these populist right parties that otherwise you would expect would align more with the neoliberal thinking and the sort of the ideology of the right, which is to be suspicious of the state and to downplay and to remove the state from life and to marketize and so on, is the opposite in this case. They're drawing straight from the Social Democrat playbook, right? And the reason they do that is because they know that most of their voters today are from that voter base. They are people of lower income. They're people that would more likely or historically would have voted for the left-leaning Social Democratic parties. And again, the big difference between those populist right parties and our one is that Farage is even more neoliberal, even more Thatcherite than the outgoing Tories.
Yeah. I think we've got the one about welfare nihilist. Maybe you better explain that.
Talk us through that one.
So it's an attempt to just do a graph of what I've been saying there, which is you look at how the RUK is, is up there in terms of the social and economic policies, right? With Fratelli in Italy and the PVV in the Netherlands and the FPO in Austria. So a high score means that you're more conservative, right? So that's going to be all these aggressive policies, all these policies about people being, skivers and so on. And they're up there. So again, it's just like classically conservative in that sense. But then when you look at welfare, then a high score there means that you're in favour of very low welfare spending, right? So you can see how UK are actually more aggressive than the Tories, okay? Compared on that axis, okay, with their peers, they all have this point, like this welfare chauvinist sort of approach, right? So again, we're not obviously recognising in any way positively the chauvinistic bit, but the fact that for incumbent populations, for the domestic, for the voter base, they're playing this lefty card is well, the way I put it in the paper is it's testimony to just how successfully embedded progressivism has become in PR countries, and that's because they've normalised. We've always had, voices there that have been ensuring that you don't erode and you don't end up, and the stats, the wellbeing stats, Danny has been the champion of this, but ahead of anyone else. Danny Darling, the child mortality stats is probably the most powerful example of that. This is what happens after decades of decades of underinvestment in well-being society. So there you go. I mean, it's not to say that if the populist parties had a chance at power or they could influence in these countries, then at least the incumbent population, the needy, the lower income people would not be punished. In the UK, when they get into power, it's going to be even worse.
We know that Reform UK is a party for billionaires, financed by billionaires in the fossil fuels industry, and there is nothing in it for poor people. And yet they seem to have that broad support that in class terms, there's former Tories, but there's also working class, which seems to form a lot of their support. And yet, what is it that they think they're going to get out of it when they clearly are not going to do anything that improves the lot of people who aren't billionaires and fossil fuel industries?
Absolutely. And the tragedy is that these people have spent so long in a country where, welfare has been so low, where public investment in the well-being of the country has been so low. They don't know to expect or to imagine or to, they've got no context to hope it'd be better, which is why they will attract people that would have voted for the Labour Party and a small amount of people that they wouldn't have voted. But this comes to the other thing then about reform that makes it different from its peers on the continent. And that's the proportion of its voters that come from, traditionally in the UK anyway, what you would consider more middle class, middle English backgrounds, right? So it's not a class distinction. It's more about an experience of status, right? This is linked to the same phenomenon that caused Brexit, right? So Brexit wouldn't have happened had the English establishment, the middle class of England, voted in line with the government, which is what has happened more or less, everywhere in the UK until that referendum. You think about the 75 referendum, the EU, you think about the AV referendum, British voters fell in line, and even you could argue our referendum, right? Why did we lose? Because our establishment class said, better the devil you know, right? But that's not what the English Tories said in the southeast, the east, and the northeast, the sort of like the East Midlands parts of England during the Brexit vote. And this is the biggest surprise, the big bombshell. And what the data shows you is that over the last 20 years, these are the areas of England that have suffered the greatest increase in relative deprivation. These are the people that have experienced the greatest attack on their sense of status, their sense of well-being, a real experience of being downwardly mobile, right? Which is how we're characterising it. And there's a much bigger group of that profile in our populist party in the UK than any of our peers on the continent, which is why middle class people, they're still against raising taxes, still against government money being spent on people that should be working harder and so on, which is why there's every chance that if Farage does get to power, that this very neoliberal element of his policy base remains intact.
There was something John Curtice said just the other day about it used to be that voting was along class lines, but now it's far more along the lines of the Remain or Leave. It's the Brexit vote. Those divisions are still what drives you a lot of political choices. For no benefit to the people making those choices. But as we covered this a little bit in our chat with Lena, and she very rightly pushed back on us saying, isn't it dreadful? Why are they voting for reform? And she said, because they're angry. These are people who are angry and they don't feel represented by any of the parties that they otherwise could vote for. I noticed somewhere you've got the word nihilism. Does that point link? Yeah,
it's meant to sort of like just draw the stark comparison between being chauvinist as opposed to being a nihilist, right? So I suppose what I'm trying to say there is maybe chauvinism is very ugly, and obviously it is, right? It's sort of ethno, nationalists, bigoted, right? But the Reform Party in the UK is just nasty to everyone. There's no one that gets preferential treatment. So
it sounds like, as regards the populist parties in Europe, that they're kind of being quite pragmatic about the whole welfare thing. They might, themselves not want to go there, but they know that if they went along the lines of, say, Reform UK, they just wouldn't get the votes there, because that level of taking care of people and well-being, welfare, however you want to kind of frame it, that's pretty kind of set in, isn't it, to European political thinking. So it's pragmatic, then they'll go along with it. But hey, it'll only be for those of us who are born here, and it won't be for that chap who's just come in. So I can see that. So the way the polls are going in for Reform UK, I mean, like, it seems like they've managed to pass this kind of tipping point that there is with first past the post, where, yeah, it keeps them out for a certain circumstances, but if they really, get support in terms of polling, and then they manage to fragment that two-party system, actually it can flip. I mean, do you think they'd actually follow through on those much more, welfare nihilist type approach?
Well, I think so. I mean, I suppose what happens is, and to some extent, Canada's a parallel here. So the experience of like first past the post is that it just inevitably ends up with there being two parties, right? And so what would be likely to happen here is they just completely supplant the Tories. And again, this happened in Canada in the 1990s for similar but not entirely the same sort of reasons. But so effectively the then leading sort of right of centre party got outflanked by a new party also called Reform, very popular on the West Coast. And it just basically, hoovered up the entire older party and then became the new sort of like, further to the right party, again, part of this drift thing that we've spoken about. So I think there's a good chance that would happen.
Trump as well.
That's right. It's the same sort of thing. But will they be successful? I don't know. I mean, and then of course, like the question is, well, what replaces the opposition? Is that the Labour Party? And of course, the other big question for us here, like more relevant for those of us who live here, is how do we respond to that? I mean, and this is one of the motivating factors behind like me doing this work at all is that I mean, there's lots of very like inspiring people I've been dealing with south of the border, in the Labour Party and other parties, and no parties that are campaigners and PR. They've got some brilliant ideas and so on, but it's still very difficult for them to see a route through it.
I have changed my view because I've read your paper. So that's one person who managed to persuade. So the thing that I've changed on was that I was, as we'd spoken to with Lena, was going, oh God, but if we're going to have reform people at Holyrood, and there might be 19 of them, what's that going to do to our politics? How dreadful is this? But actually, if what it does is not only tempers their worst excesses, because they're not going to be able to get through their manifesto of horror, but equally they're going to be exposed. And the thing I really liked about the bit in your paper, it said that these the parties that are born out of frustration and genuine angst and people with genuine grievance, they get in there, they don't achieve what they said they were going to be, and their vote just disappears. They are punished for not achieving the manifesto they were elected on. So I think the fact it's going to be next year, that might mean that come 2029, they look, and especially if Wales is the same, they're going to be in a much weaker position, perhaps, for having been in our parliament.
That's right, and that is absolutely right. And that's another, if you want, beautiful thing, I suppose, right, of just what PR does. Like those examples you give there, where I mean, I think the first one was in Finland. It happened in Austria as well, where you can see this sort of like the opportunism for the centre-right parties in these countries that have always had to do coalitions with centrist or centre-left parties. They're never unshackled from leftism, because I mean, let's be honest, right? Politics is the same everywhere, really. All the centre-right parties in Europe would love to indulge a lot more Thatcherism and marketising and all the rest, And so in Finland, both in Finland and Austria, this is the opportunity they saw, right? Let's do a deal with these new sort of populist right people, and we'll get to really go for some serious neoliberal stuff, But of course, those guys, the populist right people, have sold themselves and they're elected to being at least the protectors of public investment, and that's the first thing that gets attacked when the neoliberal parties get any power. And of course, the populist right parties are typically the junior party in the coalition, and that means then they're more exposed. They're also desperate to get into power, and so just exactly as you've described it, that's exactly what happens. And so again, another very useful cleansing thing to say, right, what does the moderate, sensible, reasonable voter on the street see here? And of course, you have that context because the speed at which it happens allows you to consume that. You can't do that in the UK. No one's got any idea of how much more to the right we are than Callaghan was in 1979. Whereas the Gulf is so vast, like, you can't ingest it as a person living in the UK. It's too slow, So absolutely,
Can we just look at, like comparisons or contrasts between where politics is in Scotland compared to the kind of, in terms of assumptions about do you work with other people, do you not, in terms of compared to in England. And obviously there's a PR set up for Holyrood, and that's been used. In all but one occasion, there hasn't been a majority government, but there's been accommodation. Even if it was a minority government, people had to agree that they'd support them, say for the budget at least. And then there was the Greens and SNP alliance, but there was also Lib Dems and Labour going further back. So, do you think that kind of setup has started at least over 25 years to kind of mean that our politicians think differently compared to the sort of gut reaction, gut responses you get from, Westminster politicians?
I think it has to. I think it has to, right? Danny said, I saw that Danny Darling saying in the Parliament, you got to be careful that it doesn't change overnight just because you change the system, right? And New Zealand is the only country that's changed in modern times that's comparable to us. And it did that in the 90s. And there have been some benefits there, but the speed at which the old parties have, if you want, disintegrated or changed has been slower than I think a lot of people would have liked. And they also had a majority. I think their second last government, the one under the Labour Party, I think at the tail end of the last decade. But it's definitely better. They're almost always coalitions, or you're having to invest in expecting to be coalitions. I think the Greens and the SNP coalition at least showed people that this can be done, and this is the sort of thing that has to happen. So I can't see how it's just not in our massive advantage to live around this and have civil servants living around it and these committee rooms and like you say, I'm almost looking forward to Reform getting to power, which they will do, and if they get X votes, then they should get X seats. That's just part of the fairness. And then we see how we go from there. But the idea that a first past the post arrangement would be any more useful for us, especially given that I think the thing that's compromised the development of PR more than anything else in Scottish politics is this thing that's compromised everything in Scottish politics, and that's the constitution debate.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as long as we remain ignored, right, effectively as we are now, and I listen to some very good ideas about what we might do. If there was a path set out, then we could spend much more time having conversations about day-to-day life. In the neoliberal era, the system has shown, the first past the post system has shown that it just can't cope. Right? That's why Trump. That's why child mortality and all these other stats you spoke about in every country, even Australia, but even New Zealand still now because it lived under it for so long. Canada, we're all at the wrong end, right, of the data, right? And you can trace it back to the system under the neoliberal era.
So when you said just now, there are disadvantages to the PR system in Scotland. I don't know if you were thinking of this, but what came into my mind when you said that was actually more in terms of local government, where two unionist parties link up. And it's not because they agree about policies, it's they agree to keep the SNP and the Greens out. They agree to keep an independent supporting party out. So that's not a very, it's understandable, right? Of course you can understand it, but it's not very creative. It's not a very helpful kind of way of proceeding, is it?
No, I know. I just think, we've got a constitutional debate that needs to be resolved. And we've got one side that says that we'll just ignore it and hope that it goes away. And the other side that's saying, no, it needs to be dealt with. And until we've got a mature way of dealing with that, then no political system is going to be able to make sense of what we do, is it? That's
having said that the system favours the right. Is there a way in which our PR system, it's not full PR, it's DeHunt, but our system has actually had the same effect on the SNP as you described on these other parties, because they've come with a particular mandate voted for, because that's what people wanted. And they have been unable, because of the wider, the effect of these other parties all in the parliament, they have been unable to fulfill the most extreme part of their agenda. Therefore, the people that voted them in start to get frustrated. You see the vote dropping as they're being punished for not achieving their agenda in the same way as some of these far right ones did. So that is a party of the left that is being tempered by the system that we're in.
Maybe.
So I suppose it's kind of, is it only if you agree with them that it's a good thing, who's in charge?
And I see that's an instance of line of inquiry, isn't it? But I think the problem is that had we been operating under a constitution that would have said something like there's a majority of seats pro-independence, then that would have meant that even in 2021 we would have had a mandate for another independence referendum. But this is the thing: we don't have a constitution, and I think the unionist strategy, if it is as insidious as this, and it might be, to just say, look, let's just grind it out and wait because they're set, and is the way that is what we've been subjected to, which has got nothing to do with organised rules-based politics, right? And it's everything to do with just clever play by the real power on the island, which is Westminster. I mean, just to say as well, I mean, I think you're right. What you said there. I have been saying. Maybe a bit casually that first past the post favours the right. It certainly has done in the neoliberal era, but it could favour either side, right? It actually, the problem with first past the post, in as much as a mechanism, is that it favours the group that has two things: one, correct or the adequate dispersal of voters, and two, the ability to mobilise them. So you take the example of like the post-independence government in India from the Second World War was dominated by a left-leaning party right up until the 1980s, and that's because they had what the Tories have had in the UK and England, forever, and that's enough voters spread across the country that give you smaller but margins that allows you to win seats in the first past the post system, and the ability to mobilise them, but anyway. So, but to the original point though, I just think we don't have a fair arrangement, and the unions are under such pressure that this is effectively all they can do, right?
It almost drags them back towards first past the post type approaches, because Swinney's plan, the SNP 1 and 2, what he's trying to do is overcome the limitations that there are in a proportional representation. And I was interested in the example you gave about the Hungarian government, because they had something like 2/3 majority. And then once in power, we're able to dismantle some of the protections that otherwise would have been there. So again, it was interesting how the attractions of first past the post to the winner, is that dragging our politics rightward? And I mean, the whole adversarial pitch at Holyrood is clearly influenced by the way they do things in Westminster, not least because a lot of the parties that are actually taking part in that debate would rather we were all just down at Westminster, don't want anything to do with.
I get upset with upset's the wrong word, but it irks with me because I spent so much time doing this work that I find it sad when you find that we're also ingrained by the first past the post system. The SNP see it's expedient to actually play cards like that. Like, so there was once, I can't remember who it was, but going on about attacking, what was his name, Murdo Fraser, for never having achieved a seat, right? In the constituency, he's only ever achieved his parliament seat through the list. But that's PR, right? And so, we shouldn't be saying that it's, and the only reason you would say that it's better is because this idea that having a constituent representative in Parliament is king, and it is one of the, only arguments that I think in the first past the post narrative that makes any sense. Like, you've got this idea of a representative that is there and so on. It's not something you can't replicate in PR, but it's probably one of the only things that makes any sense. But that we come back to these ideas, and that Swinney's had to do this, and you can see what he's doing, but it makes a mockery of having a PR system in the first place. But the unions would say, however, that their idea, and they wouldn't admit that this is why, especially the Labour Party, that the reason we've got PR, the main reason really is because the Labour Party were worried about their own hegemony in Scotland, and that if you ended up with first past the post system, then what emerged would then have given the SNP such power, it would be even more difficult for them to fudge and to do the things they've done, quasi-legitimately, to sort of just keep moving along, and so in that sense, you would say, well, that strategy was actually a better one. But I think in the long term, back to your point before, what the beauty of that mistake was giving us PR because we get used to it culturally and we become PR monkeys. And then when independence comes, we're ready for the modern system. Right?
Yeah. The Welsh system, I mean, first of all, I'd got the wrong impression. I thought they'd moved to a full PR system, moved away from de Hont, but they haven't. It's further towards that than our de Hont. So it's going to be very interesting to see what impact that has on Wales in the upcoming election, not least because they seem to have three parties kind of neck and neck. It could be Labour who end up on top. It could be Plaid, or it could be Reform. So who knows? What's your thoughts on that?
I've not followed super closely. I just find that the Welsh situation where the size of the Reform vote is, I don't know how I would cope with that if that was happening here. The latest poll, was it last week? The MRP poll suggested that Reform are going to win all the border seats, curiously, right? In the next Westminster election here, which is odd.
Our border seats.
Our border seats, yeah. So the three, the borders, the two.
To slip through between the other two, because they are quite close, aren't they?
That would be the Tory vote, though, wouldn't it? They're the ones that are blue currently,
That's right. Yeah. But no, Wales, it's just a very different setup, isn't it? And their relationship with their Labour Party has always been a healthier one, where, certainly under the Drakeford days, he seemed like spoke more like Nicola Sturgeon in that area than certainly our Labour Party did, So
I was at a meeting just a week or two back, and one of the speakers, who was a bit of a warm-up act, and that was John Curtice. Usually he's the main speaker, but for this particular occasion, he was just giving a bit of background information about what polling's saying about the independence supporters in Scotland at the moment. And someone else said, we should make the list vote next year into a de facto referendum, and we get a majority there, and then we use that to go to Westminster. And that was not supported in the room. But John Curtice said, well, listen, you have to be careful. I would be very careful about doing that, because he thinks there's a definite chance that SNP will come through with another majority in Holyrood, but it'll be because of the effect of Reform. It will be certainly in the constituencies, because Reform's there splitting the other votes, split three ways now, and in terms of unionist parties, and also the effect it'll have on the list vote. So he sort of said, just be careful, because if you end up with a majority in Holyrood, but you've said, it's having a majority in the least seat that's important, you might not have one. So it just felt like a completely new landscape that we find ourselves in. Yeah,
I know, it really is, and this is I suppose it's almost a contradiction to the idea of how predictable the two-party system is supposed to be, but it does happen. The horses change, one horse dies, gets replaced by another one. But yeah, Scottish politics is just so. Because I support independence, then you always got an eye, and you're always going to settle for saying, right, well, the SNP stay in power, then at least at some point, surely the onlooking establishment says this is not going to go away. We have to start treating them with respect, right? But that isn't really a strategy, is it? So you can see how difficult for the SNP. And then if you just imagine they get another majority, off the back of all the stuff that we've been talking about, today and the last show, and we never get close to exposing this. They never get enough money, right, to do anything sensible, because Westminster doesn't get, or just countenance the need to spend more money, and that's almost like a closed discussion in the UK now. There's nowhere you can go in the mainstream media, even the Guardian, where anybody is prepared to say, well, wait a minute, actually, maybe we should be spending more money. That sounds, they've managed to win this argument. It's super irresponsible to say that, whereas it's not the case, And so, if the SNP did achieve another hugely powerful mandate, then eventually they will corrupt themselves, because eventually people will get tired, and it's just so difficult to tell, isn't it?
Just before we came into this, I was looking at there's a third poll in a row has got India at sort of 54% yes, and there was also an interview with Maximilian Robespierre, who I really like, on YouTube. He's an Irish guy, and he's got a much better grasp of Scottish politics than either our mainstream media or Westminster. And he was saying, well, hang on a minute, it's a voluntary union. How come? What's the way out? And at what point does Labour got into power, saying that they would achieve their mandate. Well, the SNP's manifesto was also, that's what they're trying to achieve. So you can't sort of block it. That's not democracy. So it feels as if the weight is coming up against Starmer at a time when he's got huge other problems.
Yeah, no, that's right. And the interesting thing, just like working with Compass and getting, and I've done talks with some of the campaign groups there. There are routes that people understand, like how to get to PR, but they all involve obviously having to bring the Parliament and the Labour Party with them, and that's obviously something that Starmer and Reeves and the senior members of the cabinet are just not interested in. But very interestingly, Andy Burnham is probably the highest profile English supporter of PR, and he was talking at the Labour Party conference last night. He was the keynote speaker in their Fringe, in the PR group's Fringe sort of discussion. But he doesn't have a seat. So, and even if he managed to challenge, and he's saying the next Parliament will make it a part of our manifesto commitment. But my worry would be if I'm looking at it from an English perspective, and and a Scottish perspective, because I mean, in my view, we want a happy, stable, sensible England, right? We don't want raging around for 10 years under Farage, right? It's in no one's interest anywhere, But they've got this massive majority just now. They've got 4 years to go. And this is probably what they're trying to do behind the scenes. They could organise to get someone like Burnham into seat, and then they get this onto the statute books, right? They've got enough time and probably enough numbers. I mean, there'd be a lot of negotiation. It wouldn't be a walk in the park, but with a 160 majority, they'd have a chance of pushing it through. How do they know in the next Parliament they're going to get into power? Even if they did, that they're going to have enough votes to carry it. There is a window just now where at least through their majority, and they've got this chance. And you sort of think, will we look back in 10 years' time? Yeah. In a Britain that's really beaten up, and
that was it. We missed it. I've been thinking the same actually. And I mean, if the Labour Party would do that and get behind it, they would be supported by the Lib Dems, who have a decent number of MPs. I mean, SNP would support it, although not many in terms of numbers. So there would be cross-party support for it. The Greens, would obviously support it as well. I mean, you never know. Even the Reform people might support it. Well, I mean, who knows? But a
year ago they would have. But
they might not now. That's true. Actually, they probably won't now. But there would be a kind of momentum. I'm not very optimistic that the Labour Party has quite understands the situation, or has got the leadership basically at the moment to get that done. And I've thought the same thing, that this may be the only kind of chance to do it. Yeah. Because we're talking about Farage was he was the kind of extremist, and he yelled from the sidelines and the edge of the pitch, as it were. But actually he has ended up having power. He hasn't been in government, but he's had a lot of power, and that's created changes. Yeah. And maybe that's on the verge of on the cusp of actually coming into power with Reform, or at least being a substantial partner in some sort of alliance, maybe with the Tories down in Westminster. But then you kind of think, so does that just mean that there becomes another person who's also starts to be the one who's on the sidelines yelling in? And, the one that comes to mind is Tommy Robertson, who's backed by money. Well, Farage is backed by money, but, Tommy Robertson is as well. And you just kind of think, oh, God, if we don't do it this session, maybe it's gone.
And they're going to be punished for not achieving all the things they were elected on. So that is going to come home to roost.
And the brutal irony of certainly, let's call it the perceived immigration problem, is partly linked to Brexit, because we've got no agreements to manage it. Again, the British establishment will go near that because they're concerned that they upset the now established norm that Brexit's happened. Let's move on. Let's get
the Brexit boats in the Channel is.
Well, yeah, I know that's. But that point you make there as well, and I find myself like, it's for quite a while now, partly because it's worth listening to the Labour people, handing off responsibility to the Tories, saying, well, we were out of power for 14 years, look at all the bad things the Tories did. But as long as they're prepared to countenance and support the system, then that's it. Intergenerational periods when we will not have the so-called, sensible party, the Labour Party in power. And the last time they had an opportunity to do something about the electoral system, they spurned it as well, because it could be as fair as possible by saying, well, no one understood how burst first past the post was or was about to become under Blair. But they achieved the majority, so they all said, my chance at power my chance of glory, move on. That's what's going to happen here. And then more than likely, we'll wait another 20 years. I sense that there's much more momentum and much more interest amongst the campaigners, certainly in the Labour group, in the Labour Party, for PR, much more urgency, right?
Yeah.
To move. But, it's just such a difficult thing to do,
Thing is, it's not like just handing the baton back to the Tories for them to come back and have another go. If they end up with a reform government, I mean, it'd be more of the sort of the Trump level of change and destruction. I mean, who's to say we're ever going to be able to repair the damage that reform's going to do and can do and will have the power to do? But another thing that John Curtice had said was that he would advocate that Labour don't fight against reform and don't try and fight on their territory, because he said Labour's actually losing votes to the Greens and the Lib Dems. That's the battleground. And it's because they're focusing on reform, they're allowing Corbyn to come up with this sort of alternative. And there's another dimension that we don't know how that would factor in a first past the post system.
Yeah.
That's right.
We might end up with Corbynites in Holyrood, which would be interesting.
Would be interesting, wouldn't it? They could kind of, them and the Greens could be nudging the SNP to be a bit more radical in what they come up with.
So I do feel sorry for Colin Fox, though, having waved the socialist banner for Scotland for so long.
I know. I'd go for Colin over Corbyn any day.
Definitely,
definitely. So I mean, it's just great talking this stuff through with you, Stuart. And having read the paper, I mean, it's really impressive. I mean, for people who are listening, go and have a look on the Compass website. You'll get hold of it. I mean, okay, it's quite long, but actually, once you get into it, it's just fascinating stuff, and it just kind of opens out the whole kind of argument and perspective on on ourselves, really, on Britain and how it works as a democracy. And so to finish on a kind of cheerier note than what we've been touching into just now, you must be pleased with how it's gone.
Yeah, I'm delighted. Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't be happier, and the fact that the Guardian picked it up and she did a review of it. It's Polly Toynbee's review. So yeah, fantastic. And I'm in the process of doing a second one, which I'm hoping is going to be as useful in that just making the case about it's game over for first past the post, particular for the onlooking Labour Party, particularly in Scotland, that they have to embrace this and so I'm absolutely delighted.
Come back and talk to us about that paper when we get that done, because we love this.
Just email us. We'll have you on again, because it's great. Great stuff.
It is. Okay.
Well, thanks very much. I'll hopefully see you soon. But great stuff.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.